Joe, I'd ask you to elevate Rick Ray. He should be one of the participants. He'll be our first presenter.
Does Rick have material that needs to be put on the screen?
Rick does not. Wait a minute, let me think here. I don't believe he does.
I have just unmuted. Can you hear me?
Rick. Yep.
Okay.
You can hear me?
I can hear you. Rick?
Yes.
This is Michael Fiorentino. Thank you for coming aboard. I'm just going to introduce you here briefly. I know he's a known quantity to many of you in the township, but I just want to point out that Mr. Ray has both a BS and a master's in horticulture, the master's from Virginia Tech. He's been a teacher of horticulture for most of his career at places like Temple, Delaware Valley College, and also at the Arboretum School of the Barnes Foundation. In 2007, he co-founded the Marple Tree Commission and served as its chairman for 10 years. He is now the township horticulturalist, serves on behalf of the, he helps residents on behalf of the Code Enforcement Department and serves as a liaison to the Park and Rec Board and the Board of Commissioners. With that, I'd like to ask you, Mr. Ray, if that's a fair summary of your background.
Yes, it is, and much more.
Great. Also, I'd like to ask you if you'd had an opportunity to review any of the documents that have been submitted by the developer and the developer's consultants.
Yes, I have.
All right. Based on the familiarity that you generated with this developer's proposal, would you be willing to provide some of your opinions and insights to the board at this time? Please proceed.
Yes, I can. Ladies and gentlemen.
If I may, Mr. Metlowski, I'm not posing an objection as of yet, but I would like to know, is Mr. Ray appearing on behalf of council? Is he appearing in his official capacity as a representative of Marple Township? Or is he merely here as a citizen and testifying as a citizen or presenting evidence as a citizen of Marple Township?
That's a fair point, Hugh. We are presenting him as a private citizen, and he is speaking on behalf of the three entities that I represent: Crum Creek Neighbors, Safe Marple Green Space, and Darby Creek Valley Association.
And have either you or Mr. Ray asked this township council for permission to proceed in this regard?
I have not. I'm not aware of whether Rick was. I don't believe that's in any way required. He is not he's not serving as an employee of the township, and he is not testifying or presenting here tonight on behalf of the township or as a representative in any way of the township.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, Mr. Ray, you may proceed. Thank you.
Understand that the Sproul Road Developers plan involves the construction of 141 residences, more than a dozen stormwater basins, as well as roads and parking areas on the property that currently host what is known as the Don Guanella Woods. I'm familiar with this area, having been given a tour through the woods around 5 years ago. I have examined the developer's submissions, in particularly the Hossbach tree report and assessment matrix. I've also examined the new tree replacement plan submitted in October for the property, which the developer claims is in compliance with the tree protection provisions of our zoning ordinance. I disagree. In my view, Mr. Hossbach examines the conditions of the trees in the forest from the perspective of a forester, whose end goal is the production of lumber. He claims a large number of the trees in this area of study are dead or dying. Understand the forest area in which he cataloged the condition of the trees is that portion which stands in the footprint of the development, some 46 acres of forest. Contrary to Mr. Hossbach's claim, that this is a dying forest. I believe it is healthy forest. The forest in its natural state of succession. The trees that are dead are a natural phenomenon. Trees die and are replaced by shade-tolerant trees. It is a natural progression to a climax forest. American beeches and hickories are climax trees that are existing in the forest, and young ones are being established inside the forest, which I have seen. Many of the trees Mr. Hosbach considers in poor condition and says they should not be counted for compensation and replacement under the tree protection zoning provision will live for many years, far longer than the period he claims, and they will provide stormwater management during that time, not to mention habitat for wildlife. I make that statement based on the description of the injury and the accompanying photograph in Mr. Hosbach's tree assessment matrix. Specifically, I don't see the injuries as life-threatening to the trees within 5 years as he claims. In my opinion, many of these imperfections would not stop the tree from living 50 years and may heal over in time. I repeat, he looks at the forest as a lumberman, which is what he was trained for. The tree provision in the zoning ordinance section 300-63D only allows removal of a diseased or weakened tree if it is necessary. I repeat, necessary, because of the disease or injury itself. The removal of these trees is far from necessary. They are alive and will remain alive for many years, providing the benefits I mentioned. Unless the trees are located in the area where houses are being built, there is no reason to remove them and disturb nature. They are in fact being removed because it would be necessary for the construction of this development. And under that reason, in the ordinance, the developer must compensate the township with 3-inch trees at double the number being removed, and they must be replanted on the property. His tree assessment matrix features 150 pages of charts and photographs of trees claiming to be dead or dying or in poor condition. He fails to provide photographs of approximately 180 of them. But in any case, by my count, he claims that 69 of them are dead/dying. In his report, he has a chart where he tallies the total number of qualifying trees, those of 12-inch diameter, breast high or greater, and then deducts dead and dying trees and those he claims are compromised by vines, to come up with the number of trees he believes the developer is required to compensate for. The number of dead and dying trees in the report are 335, but in the assessment matrix itself, he only lists 69 as dead or dying. For this reason I gave above, the board should not agree to waive compensation for those 266 trees still living in the matrix. Thus, based on the double replacement provision in the ordinance, the total number of additional 3-inch DBH trees the developer should be planning on the property, but is not proposing to, is 532. Without a minimum of 532 additional trees proposed for replacement, I don't believe this plan is compliant with our ordinance. I've examined the tree replacement plans recently submitted by Baraton Landscape Contractor. It states that it will plant 3,200 trees on the site in 6 separate zones, most of which are narrow strips in close proximity to houses, with one large on top of the existing 4-acre landfill. The plan states the trees will be planted 8 feet apart from each other. That is too close. The result will be aggressive competition among the trees for survival, and over the long term, maybe many will be lost. It is also a very dense patch of trees which will prove to be of little use to residents of this development. As I see, some of the zones are taking up a little bit of open space that would have been available near the houses. Further, many of the trees that are proposed for the site need to be shade tolerant if they are to be planted in the woods. Sassafras, sycamore, birch, red cedar, which is really a juniper, red mulberry, and Rutgers hybrid dogwoods, which I would have to say is not native, are not shade tolerant. I've seen red mulberry only 4 times in my life, and it may be hard to source. At least half of the recommended trees will not survive in such a tight woodland. The problem is compounded by the need to squeeze an additional 532 trees or more replacement trees. It appears there are a very high number of trees to remove and no room to plant the replacement trees. I repeat, no room to plant the replacement trees. My guess is why they propose to shoehorn in, underline the word shoehorn if you would, these trees. In fact, it is questionable whether the plan can be complied with the tree protection ordinance if the 532 additional trees come in, or even if they don't. In my opinion, only one way to read the 2-for-1 replacement requirement of 300-63F of the zoning code is that the planting of new replacement trees must be reasonably done, where most trees have a fair chance of survival. Just as the township would not accept a plan where the root balls were to be buried well below the surface, plant them high and they'll live, or some other negligent technique, nor should it accept a plan where the high density of planted trees guarantees significant losses over time. The additional 532 trees would cause them to need an even tighter spacing than the current unacceptable 8 feet apart. Since stormwater management is a major concern for this development, I think it's important to note the following. 1 foot or more diameter tree replaced by 2 standard 3-inch trees may take 20 years to grow in a woodland and will not provide comparable storm water management for as long. It takes a while for a tree to grow, and when you take down a tree that's a mature tree, it just isn't replaced instantly by 2 trees. One additional effect that carves up the forest in the manner in which the developer intends is that they will create a great deal of new forest edge. A very large number of formerly interior trees, which will now be exposed to the wind shear, invasives, and vines, which is what the problem we have now in the open area. This will cause greater tree losses than the developer initially removes. Last, I'd like to point out that Mr. Hosbach indicates there is a Russian olive on the property. He's actually saying autumn olive, which is a common and prolific invasive. There haven't been any Russian olive for 40 years in the Philadelphia area. Our climate is changing, and if you can find one, I'd like to hear about it. I thank you, gentlemen and ladies.
Thank you, Mr. Ray, and I just have to do a quick clarification and make sure I understood something that you said for the record. I think you stated that without a minimum of 532 additional trees proposed for replacement, you did not believe that the plant would be compliant with the ordinance. Was that your testimony?
Yes.
Okay. I think that was the only part that I needed to clarify. One other quick point. You were on the call for at last meeting when the witnesses for the developer were asked about how much money it was costing them to put in the proposed 2,000 whips in their alternative forest enhancement plan. Were you on the call for that?
Yes, I was.
Okay. Can you tell the board, from your experience, the average price differential between a whip and a 3-inch tree of the same species?
If you have a if you have a whip in a pot, it may be anywhere from, say, $20 to $60. If you have a comparable 3-inch tree based on 6 inches off the ground in a bold and burlap situation, it could be anywhere from $100 to $150, maybe even $200, depending upon the nursery you go to, the quality of the nursery, as far as wholesale pricing.
All right. And if it was not if the whips were not in a pot, but rather bare root, would that change the expected cost of the whip?
The whip would be much lower price. It could be as little as $8. It could be as much as $10 or $15, depending upon how tall the whip was, how long it's been in the ground in the nursery. And there's obviously the cost would change slightly.
All right. All right. That's my last question for you. Mr. Ray is available if there's any questions from the members of the board.
Rick, just one question. If 8 feet apart is too close, how many feet apart should they be?
Well, in the township, I plant things 50 feet apart. Now, if you're trying to create a open space woodland, I would say that we're more talking about 20 feet. That's why you could have recreation underneath those trees. Otherwise, you're turning it really into a competitive forest, which means that the closer they are, the more trees will be up tall and skinny, which is the way lumbermen like them, because they have fewer side branches and therefore fewer knots.
Thank you.
All right. If there are other questions from the board, if not, Mr. Ray would be available for questioning by counsel for the developer.
Mr. Ruvo, if I may.
Yes, of course.
Thank you. Mr. Ray, I'm not quite sure I understand. Are you still a member of the Marple Township Tree Commission?
Yes, I am.
And we can agree, can we not, that that commission puts out various messaging on the internet?
We do have a inadequate website, and we have a little bit of it. Someone tried to put a Facebook page up.
So I assume my answer to my question was yes, you do put some messaging out on the internet.
We don't put anything active out. We just have a reference format.
And if I can quote, isn't it true that the Marple Tree Commission has stated, let us not underestimate how helpful and effective trees are as BMPs, best management practices. While they are not the only storm water management tool, they are particularly effective and appropriate for residential settings. By urging homeowners and requiring developers to restore tree populations in towns and cities, by regulating tree removal, and by planting public tree communities, can reestablish the protective leaf canopy and go a long way toward retaining our precious fresh water and healthy soil. We also enjoy the bonus of a lovely community. And first question is, isn't that in fact what the Marple Tree Commission wrote?
I believe it is. And I think that's a very good philosophy to go for.
Thank you very much. And you failed to mention, sir, but isn't it true that this revised tree replacement plan addresses all the outstanding issues outlined by the review by the Marple Township engineer and complies with the zoning ordinance tree replacement requirements? Isn't that true, sir?
I'm not sure that it follows the compliance based on what I just read you.
Sir, have you read the memorandum provided by Mr. Mastronardo, the township engineer, in that regard?
I'm not sure which one you're talking about.
I'm talking about the one in this case that he wrote with respect to this project, the tree replacement plan. Have you read it?
Are you talking about the code or something he wrote recently?
I'm talking about something he wrote recently.
I'm not familiar with that.
And is it not true that Mr. Mastronardo is the person who is required by the township to review the various requirements imposed by the code as opposed to yourself?
That is true.
Objection. I'm going to object at this point. That question is calling for a legal conclusion. This witness is not, this presenter is not qualified or required to answer a question like that. Mr. Donahue can ask Mr. Mastronardo what his roles are in the township.
Sir, this is cross-examination, but thank you for your comment. Sir, my understanding then is that you have issue, or you take issue with the type of trees suggested by the developer, the spacing of those trees, and the methodology of planting. Is that correct?
You heard my presentation, yes.
Thank you. But the last time you were in this forest was 5 years ago. Isn't that correct?
That's true.
That's your own testimony. The people, the experts that were in this forest most recently and who wrote a report were the developers' experts. Isn't that correct?
I believe they've been in there more recently than I have, yes.
Thank you, sir. And being as concerned as you are, and being that you've been in the township over the course of the last 3 to 4 years, have you provided any written documentation as how you think these trees should be planted, other than your testimony tonight? Have you prepared any report?
No, I have not.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ray, for your time.
All right. I don't have anything further for you, Mr. Ray. Thank you very much for presenting tonight. At this point, Mr. Mastronardo, I would ask if you would elevate Timothy Devaney.
Are there presentation materials that need to be shared?
Yes, Mr. Devaney, we do have, I believe, 3 exhibits for him.
You also just tell me which ones they are.
Yeah, sure. I believe one is titled 3 ISA on vine cutting.
Mr. Devaney, you can unmute. You have to unmute your own mic to talk.
Joe, there's a second one that is entitled, or has Scott Arboretum in the file name. Yeah, that's the first one. We could start with that. Do we have Tim on audio yet?
He has, I can't unmute him. He has to unmute himself.
All right, am I on?
Yes.
Okay. Good evening.
Thank you, Mr. Devaney. Can you hear me? This is Michael Fiorentino.
Yeah, I can. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay.
Just want to give you a brief introduction before you present.
Thank you.
Sure. Now, Tim Devaney studied horticulture at the Arboretum of the Barnes Foundation and the Wagner Institute of Science. He researched and compiled the shade tree ordinance adopted by the Borough of Ridley Park, and he has been certified by the International Society of Arborists as an arborist since 1998. He is a tree tender for the, I believe it's the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society, and he presently serves on the board of the Darby Creek Valley Association. Mr. Devaney, is that a fair summary of your relevant background?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome. So, Mr. Devaney, had you had an opportunity to examine any of the documents that were submitted by the developer on issues in your area of expertise?
Very much so.
All right. Did that include, well, why don't you tell us what that included?
The developer's arborist report and the tree assessment matrix, mainly I focused on.
All right. Thank you very much. At this time, I'd ask if you could, if you have some opinions and insights regarding the issues pertaining to this development that affect the woodlands and its the compliance with the code, please go ahead and proceed.
Good evening. The developer's arborist report and associated tree assessment matrix that were submitted to the township regarding the health of the Don Guanella forest brazenly devalue these woods in an attempt to avoid township code required compensatory replacements. The developer's arborist matrix claims that, quote, no compensation is required, end of quote, under township code for their removal because these 443 trees are, quote, damaged beyond repair, end of quote. That assertion is wrong. Not only does his matrix fail to individually catalog the vine encumbered trees, it makes no mention of what is commonly understood by arborists, including myself, that vine encumbered trees can recover by way of proper intervention and maintenance. On page 11 of the developer's arborist report, a chart shows, quote, trees with noted defects, end of quote, numbering 335, and also lists an additional 443, quote, trees with vine intrusion causing girdling or canopy tribulations, end of quote. While vine growth is a common challenge to trees in our eastern forests, there are techniques for addressing the problem. Mr. Mastronardo, please display the ISA. We have that up now. That's the one. Thank you. This 2016 article from Arboriculture and Urban Forestry, a professional journal of the International Society of Arboriculture, addresses Oriental bittersweet, a common invasive vine. The article demonstrates that basically removal is a simple, straightforward process. In my opinion and experience, these kinds of results are also applicable with numerous other common vines, poison ivy, Virginia creeper, wild grape, honeysuckle, etc. I think, do we have the Scott Arboretum exhibit next? If you can find that one. Yes, that's it. Okay. This website of the Arboretum at Swarthmore, which is not far from the Don Guanella site, shows photos of vine encumbered trees and how they can be rehabilitated. That's very typical. And Mr. Mastronardo, please display the ivy choking hazard PowerPoint.
Well, hold on. Before you do that, Mr.
Sure.
Devaney, are there any subsequent pages to this this particular exhibit that you'd like the board to see? We're right on the cover page right now.
Well, yeah, if you can scroll through it. I'm not sure how you're set up to do that. There's several pages. This is a public service bulletin, more or less, so people understand it. The vines can be removed and should be removed. And we can see that, you know, you can do it from the ground. You don't really have to climb the tree. It's a basic maintenance situation. Sometimes, you know, they get pretty big.
So the shot that's right on the screen right now, Mr. Devaney,
Right.
just describe for the board what essentially what technique is being used by that individual.
Well, as you can see, the vines are pretty large diameter. They've been there a long time, but what they're doing is they're growing fast up the tree to get into the canopy of the tree to get light of their own, which affects the tree. Of course, they're stealing the light and the nutrients, but you basically very carefully with a pruners, or in this case, a saw, because they're pretty woody, those vines at that level, you can saw through. It's best if you can get the saw between the vine and the trunk of the tree, just so you're not scraping the bark on the tree. but you cut through in a couple of places and pull a piece away if you can, and eventually the vine above the root system will die back. So it's
All right.
straightforward
And is that
process.
consistent with essentially consistent with the findings of that ISA article that you initially displayed in
Yes,
terms of the cutting?
right, absolutely.
All right. All right, please proceed.
Okay, the next, let's see now. If we have the PowerPoint, yes, okay, this is a very good presentation. This is designed for public education. And let's see, it's a presentation prepared by tree stewards and Arlington Regional Master Naturalists. And as I said, it's for public dissemination about, it is a choking hazard. The vines themselves choke off the health of the tree, where they inhibit the growth, they suppress it, which is what we were calling a tribulation. It's basically a depressing factor on the tree. But this is pretty good. If you can scroll through that, there's some real good photos on here, just really showing that there's the Arlington Regional Master Naturalist. And see what just scroll through. There should be I think there's some, here's a very typical, if you're out in the light, a lot of the ivy will grow around the bottom of the tree because it likes the light, but it also will grow up the tree in order to get more light for itself. It's basically scavenging the environment from which the tree itself ought to be using. So I go to the next one. I think it shows when you hand remove that very carefully, it can fairly easily be done. It takes a little diligence, but keep going. It's talking about here we go. There's a tree that's pretty typical. If it's in its sunlight, it'll grow right to the bottom. And I think there's a photo on here that shows after they've taken it off. Here's a hand pruner's. It's a pretty simple procedure here. And then see, the main thing is to cut, just break the connection between the vines and its own root system without damaging the tree, of course. But then the vines can even stay on the tree. They'll eventually dry up. So you really don't have to remove them all. Here's typically what happens. They're pretty strongly attached to the tree, but they will die back since they're not getting nutrients from the soil anymore. And there you go. There's the tree that's been cleaned up. I mean, that's pretty typical. A tree can be completely covered. And in very many cases, the structure of the tree is perfectly fine. So I thank the tree stewards for putting that together. I think they did a very good presentation. And that's available online.
All right, please, do you have additional opinions regarding those exhibits and in general your assessment of the documents you reviewed that the developer submitted?
Yes, thank you. It is my opinion as an arborist that the techniques have an excellent success rate in restoring the health of vine-encumbered trees in the Don Guanella forest identified by the developer. Trees have a remarkable ability to survive and recover from encumbrances. Vine removal is part of routine maintenance for many managed forests and even residential properties. Removing the vines will allow light, water, and nutrients to reach these 443 trees, and they will respond accordingly. It must be noted that the developer's arborist does not claim that these 443 trees are dead, and we have shown that merely because they are presently vine encumbered, they emphatically are not beyond repair. Therefore, the developer is not entitled to be exempted from the tree replacement requirements of the zoning code at 300-63F. In my experience, these trees are deserving of the protections afforded under township ordinance. These 443 trees exist in a valuable naturalized woodland setting. They add significantly to the percent of shade tree canopy cover for Marple Township as inventoried by the Delaware County Open Space Plan. To reiterate, vine removal encumbered normally recover and flourish after the suppressing vines are removed. If I recall, in dispute, one of the developer's witnesses describing the alternative compliance plan with a deer fence indicated that plan includes a vine removal component for trees not currently slated for removal because they are outside the development footprint. Given their position on the effectiveness of vine removal, a developer should not be permitted to demand an exemption from the 2-for-1 replacement requirement in the code for these 443 trees they intend to remove. Therefore, the current tree replacement plan of the developer is deficient by 886 3-inch caliper, that would be DBH, diameter breast high trees. And thank you very much. That's my comments.
Thank you, Mr. Devaney. Does any members of the board have questions for Mr. Devaney? All right, if not, then I suppose council, if you have any questions.
Thank you, Michael. I'll ask a couple of Mr. Devaney. Mr. Devaney, isn't it true that you did not inspect any of the trees referenced by Mr. Hosbach in the tree matrix?
I studied his matrix. I looked at the photos, but I did not physically go on the property, no.
Okay, so isn't it true then that you don't know how damaged the vine-covered trees are that Mr. Hosbach cited in his tree matrix?
Well, by his description, we're going by. That's all I have to go by.
But not by the actual physical inspection. So isn't it true again that you do not know how damaged those trees are that were covered by the vines that he cited in his report?
Well, how damaged relative to what? I mean, there's vines climbing the trees and he's claiming that they're damaged beyond repair. Well, that's, you know.
I'll try it another way.
Sure.
Isn't it true you don't know how damaged those trees are that are cited in his report?
Well, it's true that I have not been on the property.
Okay. I have nothing further.
Thank you.
I'll just have a quick follow-up on that. Mr. Devaney, are you aware of whether the members of the board have anything else to base their decision on other than the tree assessment matrix that
Objection. That's
provided?
objection. That's objection beyond the scope of his testimony, relies on hearsay. It's not in his personal knowledge.
You can answer.
Well, it's not hearsay if he's aware of something. It doesn't have to be based on a statement.
I just said it's not beyond the scope of his testimony and beyond his personal knowledge.
That's
He
fine.
doesn't
I'll
know what the
withdraw
other board members relied upon or are thinking.
That's fine. I'll withdraw the question. Mr. Devaney, were you invited to come onto the property to inspect the trees?
No, I was not.
Are you aware of whether the Board of Commissioners were invited on the property to confirm Mr. Hosbach's assessment of the trees?
No, I would not know that.
Okay. But to your knowledge, that hasn't happened?
No, I don't know.
Okay. To your knowledge, is anybody else associated with the opposition organizations had been invited on to the property to examine these trees?
Not that I'm aware. I had expressed an interest in going on if there was an invitation to go there, but I didn't go. And I believe the property was posted. I'm not sure. I'm only familiar with the location. I mean, from going way back, but go ahead. Thanks,
Mr. Devaney. Just one more thing. You mentioned that you examined the tree assessment matrix, and specifically that part of that matrix which discussed the 443 vine encumbered trees, correct?
Yes.
Is your recollection that discussion was a single page?
No, it's quite wordy, quite lengthy, and a lot of photos, but not sure right offhand whether the photos were of any of the trees that were supposedly vine encumbered. I don't think they were listed individually.
Okay. So your recollection is that for the vine encumbered trees, they were not listed individually?
No, I don't. They were not. No, because
All
I
right.
would have seen that.
You didn't see a section of 443 photographs depicting each vine encumbered tree, did you?
No. No.
Okay.
I did not.
All right. That's all I have for you. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have one recross based on Mr. Fiorentino's questions. Mr. Davini, are you aware that the township engineer and zoning officer were on site with Mr. Hossbach when he did his inspections?
No, I'm not aware of that.
Okay, I have no further questions.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Devaney. At this time, Joe, would you please elevate Darren LeBrake?
Before Mr. LeBrake testifies, I'd like to ask for an offer of proof as to what he's going to present. If it's similar to his planning commission presentation, then I'd like to lodge an objection.
His testimony will be similar, although I don't believe it'll be identical to, although he will be using largely the same presentation. There may be some minor amendments to that presentation.
All right. On a broad scale, then I'll object on the basis that Mr. LeBrake was previously presented to talk about the Act 2 compliance of the landfill dump site on the site, which I believe is beyond the township's purview. It is solely within DEP's purview. And his prior testimony also dealt with stream quality, which is also beyond the township's purview, which falls within the state's water quality board as well as DEP. And therefore, I would ask that he not be allowed to present materials that are relevant beyond the township's scope of their purview.
I'll, in my view, that the board should overrule that objection based on the fact that Mr. LeBrake's testimony goes to numerous issues of environmental degradation concerning the landfill on the property that's been discussed. I'm sorry, you can't hear me?
We'll hear the testimony.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. LeBrake, I see you're on here. Just let me briefly introduce you. Darren LeBrake. I'm sorry? Okay. Darren LeBrake is a certified senior professional wetland scientist, a certified ecological designer and master watershed steward with over 32 years of professional consulting experience. He manages projects with the full range of ecological issues associated with wetlands, aquatic and terrestrial habitats. He's an expert in ecological risk assessment, dating back for almost 30 years, and has worked on over 21 different Superfund sites, 11 of which were landfills throughout his career, as well as hundreds of other site investigations involving a full range of contaminants, dealing with the federal RCRA, Pennsylvania Act 2 program, and programs in New Jersey. Is that a fair summary of your relevant background, Mr. LeBrake?
Yes, it is.
Thank you. At this time, you may please proceed to identify for the board your familiarity with the development and the consultant submissions, and then proceed to provide your insights and opinions on those. Thank you.
Okay. Good evening. Before the site was posted with lots of no trespassing signs, myself and a couple of other folks from Darby Creek Valley Association went over and took a walk around the property and looked at the streams and actually did some macroinvertebrate sampling, and then petitioned Pennsylvania to redesignate the southern tributary of Whetstone Run. After quite a few years have passed, the latest development plan came forward. And then earlier this year, I believe it was in March, I was made aware of a remedial investigation report and cleanup plan that was put together by the Environmental Consulting Incorporated. Joe, if you could resize that, the bottom half of that page is kind of cut off. Oh, okay, we just have to scroll it. All right. The top half of this is a screenshot of the total summary that they have in the report of the ecological screening assessment that they did. And the pieces that are missing is that there was not a pathway evaluation for ecological receptors performed, but yet they chose to eliminate that from any further consideration. Habitats of concern were not identified or addressed in their report. Wetlands were not identified that are in the immediate vicinity of the landfill. So the ecological screening that was performed is incomplete. Could I have the next slide, please? This is text out of Pennsylvania's Act 2 regulations, and it says that if you have habitats of concern, you have to continue on and do an ecological evaluation. The only way you don't have to continue with that is in letter B there, where if number 1 and number 2, if it's jet fuel, or just number 2, fuel oil or diesel fuel that you're assessing, you get to move on. Or if the area of contaminated soil is less than 2 acres, or the area of contaminated sediment is less than 1,000 square feet. And we can see on the development plans, and it's been said probably a number of different times, that the area of the landfill is on the order of about 4 acres. So it's not less than 2 acres, and that is the area that has been sampled and been determined to be contaminated. Can I have the next slide, please? Oops. This is just the definition inside of Act 2. What are habitats of concern? And it's typical wetlands. That's the only importance of having that slide. Can I have the next one, please? Okay, so back in that other section, since none of those get out of jail free cards, as I like to refer to them, there was diesel fuel. It wasn't less than 2 acres. Then what it reads here in that first underlined section is that a on-site evaluation shall be conducted to document any indications of ecological impact. Then in D, it says, so on and so forth, a detailed on-site evaluation shall be conducted by a person qualified to perform ecological risk assessments or environmental risk assessments to document any substantial ecological impacts. Have the next slide, please. So wetlands and waters were delineated in 2015, and this was the previous developer's plan, no reflection on the current one. But you can see very obviously that all the wetlands and the waters have been delineated on here. The drawing was prepared in May of 2015, and yet the remedial investigation and cleanup report dated December 9th, 2019 does not contain any information about the wetlands and the waters that are immediately adjacent to the dump or landfill. Can I have the next slide, please? So that is sketched from the, I highlighted that red area, and then the small areas with the dots are where the monitoring wells were installed. And the gray shaded area to the, I don't see a north arrow, but I'm going to say to the northwest because I don't have a north arrow. Sure, it's not northwest. I think it's probably northeast. But you can see that there are wetlands and streams delineated right adjacent to the landfill. Can I have the next slide, please? So the light blue line on there is the edge of the delineated wetlands that are out there, and the dark blue line is the stream. And you can see the break in the trees is where this dump or landfill exists, and there's where all the monitoring wells have been installed. And number 6 is right down there, probably within about 15 or 20 feet of the edge of that wetland. And that wetland area in there exists because there's groundwater seepage at that point. Can I have the next slide, please? So when I was out there in 2015, before the whole property was posted, this is the seep down at the bottom, just below where that dump slash landfill is located. And that's an old car that's in there. And you can see in the left-hand photograph, more toward the center of the page, the water and the blackened leaves. And the reason the leaves are black is because this was in the early spring, and those leaves have been decomposing because they're perpetually saturated with water that's seeping out of the ground. Have the next slide, please. So this is the landfill as it looked in, what's my date on there? March 25th. This landfill has been unused since the 1970s, give or take. And in the intervening 50 years, no trees have grown on the landfill. Now, we don't totally understand why the previous developer went in there with a backhoe and dug up all kinds of test pits and dug all around on this landfill. But be that as it may, they didn't knock any trees down. You don't see any trees laying around the edges. So there has not been any investigation by the current consultant or the consultant that prepared the report as to why no trees have grown on the landfill in the intervening 50 years. Got the next slide, please. This goes to the groundwater evaluation that was done out there. It's pretty technical, but monitoring wells 5 and 6, which are the two that are nearest to that seep, monitoring well number 6 is right at the seep. Those wells were set in the waste immediately above the weathered bedrock, so they weren't particularly deep. That's why the remainder, monitoring wells 1 through 4, never developed any water in them because they were too high up and not far enough down to intersect the groundwater. They had a problem delineating the groundwater contours out there and understanding the groundwater. So they went in and they drilled 4 more monitoring wells, and they put those down 16 to 26 feet into the bedrock. And they provided no proof that any of the wells are in the same groundwater unit in their report. Guys, the next slide, please. So it is impossible to draw a groundwater contour map that they have depicted here when you have wells that are screened in shallow waste and wells that are screened in 16 to 26 feet into the bedrock. There is no, they did not do any investigation in the report that showed that those two groundwater systems or groundwater layers are at all connected to one another. And then the important part is that monitoring well number 6, which is at the top of that, is 20 feet, that the groundwater seep is 20 feet below that. The groundwater from the seep flows directly into Whetstone Run, and the seep aligns with the longitudinal axis or the long axis of this landfill. And the important thing to note is that when the water, you saw the previous photographs of no vegetation, there are no trees. So all the rain that falls on top of this landfill goes down into the waste. As it flows through the waste, it comes in contact with contaminants down there, and it creates leachate. There's been no investigation as to where the leachate is going. It doesn't just go away, it's flowing somewhere, but no one actually knows where it is flowing. So they've identified that the leachate has contamination in it. If you go to the next slide, please. Oops, sorry, this is, well, it doesn't really matter. This is part of their conclusions. The proposed cleanup plan, they're going to cap to eliminate potential exposure pathways, and that's fine for human health, but they have not identified or investigated the pathways to ecological receptors, which they are required to by Act 2. And then therefore they say that the concentrations of the target analyte list metals, or the metals that they detected in the groundwater, do not pose a risk to potential receptors. And I would agree that they don't pose a risk to potential human health receptors, but they haven't provided anything conclusive that says that they do not pose a risk to potential ecological receptors, with groundwater seepage and wetlands and streams within 20 to 50 feet of the edge of this landfill. Have the next slide, please. So based on the remedial investigation activities completed to date, the lack of mobility of naturally occurring concentrations of metals, which I don't know how they determined that they were naturally occurring, or that they had a lack of mobility, because they have not sampled anywhere outside of the footprint of the landfill. So you don't know whether they're leaving that landfill as leachate unless you've actually sampled beyond the limits of the landfill. So they make this large step and say that there's no expected impact to the unnamed tributary of Whetstone Run, but there's no investigation that backs that up with any sort of scientific information or data to prove that point. Have the next slide, please. And then I found it to be kind of, well, they describe what the cap's going to be. It's going to be a geotextile fabric, and then covered with 2 feet of vegetated clean fill. And that'll be the extent of elimination of human health pathways, but it doesn't really address any potential ecological pathways. So down there in the bottom, due to the naturally occurring concentration of metals detected in the groundwater, they don't have any background locations that they sampled outside of that landfill. So it's very difficult to make a definitive statement like that they are naturally occurring concentrations of metals. But I find it very interesting that this contradicts what they had in the previous one about lack of mobility, and that we're not going to have a problem with these, but yet they're going to implement an environmental covenant with the Delaware County Recorder of Deeds. And this is related to groundwater on the subject property, not necessarily, I'm sure that part of that covenant will include not disturbing the capped or the geotextile covered and vegetated landfill area. Have the next slide, please. So this is what's been detected in the groundwater at monitoring well number 6, the one that is closest to the wetland and the seep and the creek. The accepted ecological screening criteria for chromium is 10 micrograms per liter for a chronic exposure and 15 for acute, which means that at 15, it causes, probably a lethal dose at 15 micrograms per liter, which would kill half of the organisms. That's typically what the acutes are tied to, is an LC50. So you can see in here that every one of the monitoring wells, except for the deep one there, which had non-detect MD4, all of them, the yellow highlighting means that they exceed an ecological screening criteria or ecological screening value. So you got acetone to butanone, you got barium, iron, manganese, and chromium, all exceeding ecological screening values in very close proximity to a wetland, a seep, and a stream. Can I have the next slide, please? So this is just another round of data showing essentially the same thing, that there continue to be these exceedances of ecological screening values. Can I have the next slide, please? So here is the results that they have from their PCB analysis out there, where they had non-detect, and I believe that, and this was in water, so their non-detect concentration at their method detection limit was 0.11 micrograms per liter, except that the ecological screening concentration for PCBs is 0.014, or 14 parts per billion. And they could not have seen whether the concentration was in fact above that, because their method detection limit was too high. So there could be anything between the 0.014 micrograms and the 11 micrograms that they had. So the reporting limit is 28 times higher than the concentration where ecological risks could be occurring. Can I have the next slide, please? So they talk about site-specific standards for the property and that they have achieved site-specific standards via pathway elimination. And I don't disagree with that conclusion for human health, but I disagree with that determination for ecological receptors because they have not assessed whether there is a complete pathway to ecological receptors associated with the contaminants that have been identified in the landfill. And there are pesticides in there. There is DDT that's been detected in there and PCBs that have been detected in the soils, and they have not sampled outside the limits of the landfill. Have the next slide, please. So I just wanted to put a couple slides up here that show the conditions that I observed when I was out there in 2015. And this is in my opinion, based on a few decades of looking at, many decades at looking at streams in the region, and the last few decades at looking at streams in sort of the eastern and southern part of Delaware County. And this is probably one of the more stable and one of the higher quality streams that I've seen around here in areas that still have forest and have not been developed with houses. Can I have the next slide, please? These are just a couple more slides showing the same condition. You can see some in the left-hand slide at the right-hand edge of it. You can see some soil bank exposed there, but in general, that's a pretty stable channel looking across. The left-hand side has a little bit of slope going on, but it's well vegetated at the edges. And the one on the right, if this was actively eroding and down cutting and degraded stream, those two mature trees on the left-hand bank there would have roots out, horizontal, exposed. Instead, these are ones that have grown out of that bank, and over time, some of the bank has eroded, but it's been sort of what I would term a normal, stable, normal erosion, because there is topography here. There are rainstorms that come and streams do down cut and erode their banks, because if they weren't down cutting and eroding their banks, we wouldn't have salt marshes in New Jersey. Can I have the next slide, please? So there's just one, I believe that's my last slide there. Let me take a look. Yeah, that's my last slide. So you can see that the stream channels there are well vegetated. They have trees growing at the edge. This is not a degraded stream. And in my opinion, based on what I heard from Michelle Adams' testimony about the choice of curve numbers that the engineer picked for the lawns that will be releasing stormwater during storms, they picked a very high curve number. And in my opinion, these streams are going to be degraded because they have shortchanged the amount of stormwater management that should actually be designed and constructed on this property in order to maintain this kind of condition in these streams and the tributaries that flow across this site. That's what I have. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. LeBrake. I just have a couple of follow-ups for you before I turn you over to the board. The last several slides showed perhaps 4 different photographs of the stream and its banks. I shouldn't say the stream. I guess I'd like to ask you if you could specify whether that was the southern or the northern unnamed tributary to Whetstone that was depicted, or both.
I think I have photographs of both. I believe that 3 of the 4 photographs were of the northern tributary, and one of them was probably the southern tributary.
Okay, and is it the southern tributary that had been put forward by petition for redesignation for special protection?
Yes, it has. Darby Creek Valley Association filed a petition with Pennsylvania DEP to raise the water quality standard for that tributary, and it is still pending final review at the state. So they still have not made a formal determination as to whether it would be a high quality stream or whether it will remain as a unimpaired warm water stream.
All right. And so you're saying several of the photographs that you showed us were of the northern tributary. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes.
All right. And you described that stream as being a very healthy stream. Is that right?
Yes. Yes.
All right.
It's not as healthy as the southern tributary, which is on par or very close to the water quality of an exceptional value stream that's on the other side of the drainage divide from Whetstone Run. But the northern tributary is probably the highest functioning and best looking and best, I don't want to say looking because it's really not an appearance thing, the highest functioning tributary that I have encountered in most of Darby Creek's watershed.
Okay. And just to be clear, it's the northern tributary that sits very close to the location of the landfill, correct?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
All right. And the location at which you made an observation about the quality of that stream, was that above the location of the land, upstream from the landfill or downstream from the landfill?
We collected macroinvertebrates upstream of the landfill, and then the other sample location on the northern tributary was downstream from the landfill. And I took the time to look at the data from those, and in 2 of the years, the downstream location was essentially equivalent to the upstream location, and in 1 of the years, it was measurably lower quality or lower functioning than the upstream sample was. And without a longer term collection of data or more samples, it would be difficult to say whether there was sufficient dilution of whatever could be coming from the landfill and flowing into the northern tributary to actually have caused that effect.
All right. And Mr. LeBrake, you're familiar with the apparent Act 2 approval that the developers have received for their capping solution for the landfill area?
Yes, I am.
All right. Do you as a professional agree with the decision of the department in that regard?
No, I do not. And the reason I don't agree with the department's approval of the letter is that information about the site and the habitat immediately around the landfill was not included in the report. Without understanding that there is a wetland 20 feet away and a stream 50 feet away from the edge of the bottom or down gradient edge of this landfill, it would have been impossible for the DEP to come to the conclusion that sufficient data were collected and that there's no potential risk to ecological receptors.
And to your knowledge, did the department's approval involve independent verification of the claims that were made in the submittal? By means of on-site observation?
To the best of my knowledge, the DEP did not come out and perform a site visit. I wouldn't know whether they did or not, but typically the department relies very heavily on the licensed geologist who prepares the report and the information that that geologist has provided in the report. And if pieces are left out of the report, then we really can't fault DEP for perhaps making a erroneous approval.
And did the DEP collect any of its own data in coming to decision on approval?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay, you didn't see that reference in the approval itself?
No, I did not.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. LeBrake. That's what I have for you. Any members of the commission have questions for Mr. LeBrake?
John Longacre does. For us novices or people who don't know much, what would the matter whether the stream is designated exceptional, or what did you say it was currently rated?
Well, it's currently designated as a ordinary resource value warm water fishery. And what happens if it gets designated as a high quality or an exceptional value water is that Pennsylvania's anti-degradation rules come into play. With a warm water fishery, you don't have to make sure that the water that's discharging from your development is of the same temperature as the water that's in the stream, plus or minus, I believe it's 2 degrees Fahrenheit. And the flow, so with the anti-degradation, you are not allowed to change the flow, the temperature, or the chemistry of the receiving body. With the warm water, you can pretty much just let anything flow into it. That's why we have so many warm water designated streams in southeastern PA. Does that answer your question?
Kind of. So you're saying they need more processing or something done to the water more than what they're showing right now? Is that what you're saying? Or are you just saying that you don't think they can do what? How does it affect the project?
They would have to design their stormwater releases from the project to address temperature and the volume of water or the flow of water leaving the site. So okay. So if under the current conditions with the forest, you have 10 cubic feet per second leaving in that stream, after you develop the property during exactly the same storm event, okay, you only get 10 cubic feet per second. So you're not allowed to change the flow or the temperature in it. Okay. So there would have to be additional stormwater controls, not astronomically expensive. And you would have to also find ways to reduce the thermal impact, because if you think about the stormwater that's leaving all of the impervious surfaces and flowing into the stormwater basins, that's very hot water. Like in, it's like 80 degree water flowing off of those paved surfaces in the summer months. So you would have to control the temperature of that in your stormwater basin. You might have to make the stormwater basin a little bit larger. You might also have to put in a more vegetated swales and other things to cool that temperature down before you release it to the stream. So does that help your understanding?
Yes. Now I had a second question. Okay, so you're suggesting that the original study wasn't enough. I mean, what would you say needed to be done, if anything, so that there wouldn't be ecological damage? So you didn't like the way they put the wells in. What could they do different now? Is it expensive, or does it even matter based on what they're doing? To kind of explain that, if that's the case or not.
Okay, well, since no one knows where the leachate is going, the leachate is the water that's flowed down through the waste and become contaminated. Nobody knows where that's going. Yeah, I've been around a lot of wetlands and a lot of seeps.
Is that incumbent on them? Is that incumbent on them to find that?
Well, they have to show that it is not, that the leachate and the contaminants in the landfill are not discharging through that groundwater seep and into the stream. So the only way to do that is to sample the water that's in the leachate, or that's in the seep that's flowing into the stream. And then they would have to do a little bit better groundwater investigation to determine actually which direction the groundwater is flowing, and then go over and sample the stream where you would be expecting that groundwater to discharge into the stream. So, and that may not be straight downstream. That might be off to the south a few hundred feet.
So are you saying they put in 1 well, 10 wells, no wells, dig a ditch? What are you saying here? So I get an understanding
Yeah.
of what's really going on.
It's okay. You probably have to put in about 3 or 4 more wells, run a pump test on it to find out which way the groundwater is actually flowing, and then go and sample that groundwater seep to find out if any of the contaminants in the landfill are oozing out through the seep and going into the stream. And then you would sample a couple locations in the stream, upstream, next to, and then downstream.
And how long does that? Okay, so your premise is that they didn't do it right, which they'll probably disagree with. But how long would this take to do if you were right?
A couple of months. It's not a huge undertaking. The sampling of the seep and the stream could be done in 2 weeks.
Okay, you've answered my questions, I think. I'm not, you know, but okay, at least I have a better understanding. Thank you.
Yeah, I apologize if I get kind of technical on this. I do it all the time, so I'm not the best at explaining it.
No, you explained it very well. You made your point.
Okay.
So I just wanted to understand if you're right, what, in your opinion, where we go from here. So.
Yeah, they need to complete the investigation. And if nothing is going, if nothing's leaving in the seep and there's nothing showing up in the stream, well then fine. There's no ecological risks to worry about. But if in fact it is going in there, then you have to treat that landfill a whole lot differently. Like you have to stop that stuff from continuing to flow through the seep and into the stream. So that's sort of, you know, maybe there's nothing going on, but if there is, you have to go and address it.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Anybody else from the board? All right, council.
Thank you,
Mr.
Michael.
LeBrake available.
Appreciate it. Good evening, Mr. LeBrake. Did I hear your testimony correctly that in March you became aware of the remediation plan for the landfill that's on the site?
Yeah, sometime around when it was either provided to the township and someone let me know via email, or that I found it in the Pennsylvania Bulletin.
Oh, okay. That was going to be my next. That was my next question. Do you recall when you found it advertised in the Pennsylvania Bulletin?
I believe it was in March. I would have to go back and look.
I believe April 25th was the date that I had found. So,
okay.
What does, based on your experience, if you can tell us, what does the publication in the Pennsylvania Bulletin mean? Or what purpose does it serve?
Objection.
My understanding.
Asking Mr. LeBrake to provide a legal conclusion about the legal effect of a notice in the Pennsylvania Bulletin.
I'm asking to his knowledge if he knew.
I think he can answer that.
Yeah,
What is under?
Yeah, it's the way it reads in the notice is that they have approved the remedial investigation report and cleanup that's been proposed.
Okay, so you were aware back then that it was approved by DEP, correct?
Sure. Yes, I was.
Okay, and isn't it true that DEP is the government agency tasked with regulating and administering the Act 2?
Yes.
Okay. In your presentation, I heard you speak many times about multiple geological aspects such as groundwater, monitoring wells, underlying hydrogeology, water well construction, etc. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
Okay, but you're not a geologist, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Do you know that the engineering, land surveyor, and geologist registration law in Pennsylvania defines the practice of geology as, and let me make sure I get this right, the practice of describing natural processes acting on earth materials, predicting the probable occurrence of natural resources, and predicting and locating natural or man-made phenomena which may be hazardous, and recognizing, determining, and evaluating geologic features. Do you know that that act Law also defines the practice of geology as including the performance of geologic investigation, evaluation, and inspection of geological work required in implementing the provisions of any federal, state law, or regulation, or the provisions of a local ordinance. Can you answer the question? I don't think you can just shrug your shoulders. It's either yes or no.
Can you
want to repeat it?
Yeah, can you rephrase the question? Because I don't understand. Am I supposed to just confirm that I have heard what you read, or that I should have some sort of knowledge regarding what you have read?
I'm asking whether you know that the definition of geology includes what I just read.
No, I don't.
Okay. And are you aware that it's unlawful in Pennsylvania to practice geology unless you are licensed or registered?
Yes, I am aware of that.
Okay. Multiple times towards the end of your testimony, and I think in response to Mr. Longacre's some of his questions, you testified about water quality of the tributaries on the property. Isn't that correct?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And aren't the water course designations of those tributaries determined by the Environmental Quality Board and not this township?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. I have nothing further.
All right. Mr. LeBrake, I don't think I have anything further for you other than the fact that in your, let me ask you this, Mr. LeBrake, in your practice of, your business is called Wetlands and Ecology, is that correct?
Yes, it is.
All right. And as you've indicated over the course of your career, in many of these projects that you worked on are in Pennsylvania?
Yes.
Is it common for you to, when you're examining environmental remediations and the proposals for those remediations, for you to examine the well networks and the data that are generated by monitoring well networks?
Yes, very frequently.
All right. So understanding where water seeps, where leachate may seep from a landfill, is that within the purview of your experience as a wetlands scientist and ecologist?
Yes. Yes, and in the practice of ecological risk assessment, I need to understand where the groundwater is discharging so that I can evaluate whether there are ecological risks at the location where the contamination is intersecting with a natural resource. And one of the things that I'd like to point out is back on slide number 4, you don't have to go back to it, but it says in there that the on-site evaluation shall be conducted by a person qualified to perform environmental risk assessments to document any substantial ecological impacts. And I don't believe that was in anything that, he's not on the screen now, that the council described as under the purview or under the licensing authority of a professional geologist in Pennsylvania.
Okay. All right, Mr. LeBrake, thank you. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you.
All right. I believe we're done with Mr. LeBrake. And Joe, would you please elevate Fred Stein? Fred, do we have you?
Sorry, the screen was jumping all over. I couldn't grab him quick enough, but he's here now. Fred, you need to unmute.
Fred, can you hear us? Can you speak to us, Fred? Fred, are you there?
I'm here. Sorry about that.
Okay, I see you now. All right. Yeah, briefly, just by way of introduction, Fred Stein has been a long time, 20 years in fact, stormwater management employee for the Delaware River Keeper Network. He is a certified stormwater inspector by the National Stormwater Center, and he regularly presents MS4 training to municipal officials and the general public. He's a co-author of a training manual entitled Muddy Waters, A Citizen's Guide to Reducing Non-Point Pollution. Mr. Stein, your work also encompasses technical input on BMP design, implementation, and maintenance. Is that true?
That's correct.
All right. Is that a fair summary of your relevant background?
The only thing I'd add is, since my presentation tonight or my testimony has to do with pollution reduction plans, PRPs, as an employee of the Delaware Riverkeeper Network, I've commented on several different municipalities in Pennsylvania on their PRPs as they were going through the DEP process. All
right. And Mr. Stein, have you had the opportunity to review any of the documents submitted by the developer or listen to any of the information they've presented in these meetings?
I have. I've been a member, or been a part of rather, each of the township meetings at the planning board level also. I reviewed the Village of Sproul Run's post-construction stormwater report. I've reviewed Marple Township's PRP, the pollution reduction plan on their website, and also Meliora's June 25th, 2020's stormwater comment presentation.
Oh, that was the presentation by Michelle Adams?
By Michelle Adams, yes. She's a principal at Meliora Design.
Yes. And thank you, Mr. Stein. At this point, please proceed to, I see your presentation is up on screen. Please proceed to provide your opinions and insights to the board.
Thank you very much. Joe, do you advance my slide or do I advance the slide?
I think Joe does it.
Okay. All right. So my presentation, it wants to focus on two different aspects. One is the impact of this proposed development on the township's own MS4, specifically the pollution reduction plan, the PRP, and also the impact this project may have on downstream communities in terms of flooding. I wanted to point out in preparation for tonight's meeting, I noticed in going to the township's website that the township's MS4 stormwater permit was located on your website in popular links. There's a section on the website under popular links. And it just struck me that, and I don't know whether the township, a township employee had positioned it there or whether it was from the interest of the community that they realized that the community was interested in the MS4. But it just seemed in that position, really a prominent position on the website. It just seemed it's obvious that the municipality and the community is very interested in compliant, or at least with the MS4 stormwater management and the flooding elements of that. MS4 is part of the solution. So I just wanted to raise that point. What you're looking at here is the cover page of Marple Township's PRP. Under the PRP, and that's part of the township's MS4 permit, stormwater permit that they have to comply with. The PRP was designed and targets to reduce non-point source pollution in the township's waterways, not just Marple, all communities throughout the Commonwealth. Specifically, they're looking to reduce total suspended solids and nutrients by 10% by 2023. And every municipality needed to have an engineer evaluate that the amount of runoff coming in each of the watersheds and sub-watersheds in their community, and come up with a plan on how are we going to reduce the nutrients and total suspended solids by 10% in 2023. And So as you know, the villages at Sproul Road that we're talking about tonight is in a sub-watershed of the Whetstone Run and the Darby Creek. And the stormwater runoff that will be coming off of this site will flow downhill. Obviously, it flows downhill, and it'll go down and it'll flow down to the intersections of Reed Road and Red Hill Drive. And then it'll go from Reed Road Reed Road to Parkway Drive. I'm bringing that up just for a visual so you know the direction that this is heading down, where it's flowing to off the site. As shown in the township's pollution reduction plan, the township engineers have calculated that the stream that is small currently, with the land use at the site in its current forest and natural open space condition, a small stream bank restoration would be adequate to accommodate the current runoff from this area, from this sub-watershed area, to manage and meet the 10% compliance with your PRP and your MS4. The calculation though is not based on the loss of the forest that's being proposed in the development project or the loss of other open space that's part of the proposed development, nor is it calculating in all the 16 or 17 acres of impervious coverage that will be part of this proposed development. As our stormwater management expert, Michelle Adams, pointed out in the testimony, it is our position that, and I'm repeating what Michelle gave testimony to, is there's flaws in the stormwater calculations and the design. So an increase in downstream runoff and potentially more flooding is going to be the result of this development as the stormwater design and runoff is currently calculated. You can advance the slide. This is I talked right through this. You can see, this is an image from Marple Township's PRP plan. And you can see in the checked image to the right there, that's the intersection of Reed and Sproul. And it's showing that this is the area that the stormwater will be coming into, and it goes towards the east there. That's down towards Reed and Red Hill Road. You can go to the next slide, please. Now, not only does the current conditions of that site don't calculate the increased runoff from this change in land use that's being proposed, nor does it calculate in the inadequacies that Michelle Adams found in the curve numbers and the design of the stormwater management system. It doesn't take into account the changing weather patterns, which I think is significant. The image you see here in front of you is a report from the NOAA's weather report from July 10th, 2020, this summer, where it shows that the rainfall in this area was 4.15 inches of rain in a 24-hour period, which is exceeding the developer's 2-year storm. The point being is that these rainfall events are occurring more frequently. And, if a stormwater system does not manage that volume of water, you're going to have downstream flooding. If you could go to the next slide. This is July 10th. If you could go to the next slide. Here we have just 2 weeks later. I think this was Tropical Storm Isaias. And here again, 4.16 inches of rain. These are not anomalies, these storms. These are becoming more and more frequent. And so again, if you're clearing forests and if you're putting in stormwater basins that are reported to be inefficient or not inefficient, inadequate, I should say, and you have these storms, downstream flooding is going to be problematic. Next slide, please. This is taken from Michelle's presentation, just as a reminder that this is the changing land use and anticipated increase in stormwater, the impacts of that. You can go to the next slide. So my second point, the second point that I wanted to bring up, and this is, I know I'm speaking to the choir here when I'm talking to the Board of Commissioners here, is that there's a flooding problem. You know, these are images, and you could get many, many more. You know, these are Marple Township or flooding events that have happened in Marple Township. My next point is that, then I want to drive this home, is that floods like this, you can go to the next slide. Floods like this are a death by 1,000 cuts. It's not one development project that will have an impact. It's many projects. It's a resident that wants to put a family room on their house, or divide a large property into two. But what we're talking about here with the villages of Sproul Road is not a small project. This is a very large project. Here you have images of the Darby Creek and your downstream neighbor of Springfield Swim Club. This was, I think, in 2020, I believe this was, and flooding. And the next image, please. Next slide. And yeah, this is Isaias. Could you scroll up? Is that, I guess it doesn't. Yeah, no, this, again, this is just the emphasis. The emphasis here again is just continued weather events on August 5th of 2020. These are significant storm events. This isn't, you know, from Missouri. These are in Southeast PA. Next, please. And the images coming next is this is repeating it. This is 2019 in the Springfield Swim Club again. And these are the point is that upstream projects have downstream effects. I'm sure that everyone in Marple Township thinks of development in Radnor Township or Newtown Township, and knows that as projects up there get developed, new stormwater is being sent down to Marple Township. And it's great when you can think that those municipalities upstream are considering the downstream impacts, because you know that that's a neighbor that's considering, you know, the community and what's happening downstream. And that's what we're thinking. That's what we're hoping that the board tonight is considering, is what's happening downstream. Could go to the next slide, please. And it's not just flooding of streams. This is flooding small businesses here in Darby, PA. These are recent pictures. This is like impacting not only Darby but also communities up and down the Darby Creek watershed. Go ahead, advance it, please. And there are other costs. These are generic pictures, some from my town, but these are probably not an unusual sight if you were part of the Department of Public Works. Local flooding has a price to pay, not only in businesses and people's basements, but there's a cost to the municipality and local dredging and road projects and sewer overflows. There's a real cost. And my point here is that the township has to be considering these costs as they think about a project like this, which can clearly exacerbate local flooding. Next slide, please. And further down, and these are my last couple of slides. Further downstream is a community called Eastwick, Pennsylvania. It's down by the John Hines Wildlife Refuge. And Eastwick is at the bottom of the hill. And Marple Township, even though you get flooding, you're kind of towards the top of the hill, not at the very top. But Eastwick gets hammered every time there's a heavy storm event. These are pictures, you can see a little bit older pictures where communities get flooded and families and lives are devastated. Next slide, please. Just here again in Isaias in August, more downstream flooding. Next slide, please. Where you need to, where you're having people, boats going up neighborhood streets to pull people from their flooded homes. And again, this is a situation where, upstream communities, as part of the equation is what you're thinking about is what's happening to this water that's coming off of our streets and where is it going? This is again in Eastwick, where, in my neighborhood in suburban New Jersey and up in, just as in Marple, when it's raining outside, you're wondering if your windows on your car are rolled up. Down in Eastwick, they're wondering if they have to run home and put sandbags in front of their garages or around their sheds because the water gets to be so deep, and sandbags keeps the flood waters out. So again, this is a community awareness and concern about downstream neighbors. So I think this is my last slide. Again, stormwater and flooding is death by 1,000 cuts. And clearly what you men and women are weighing is a large potential cut that we're hoping that you consider not only flooding in Marple Township, but also downstream. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stein. Does any of the members of the board have questions for Fred Stein? All right, I'm not hearing any. Then would council like to ask some questions of Mr. Stein?
Yes, thank you. Mr. Stein, can you hear me?
I can, thank you.
Great. Have you reviewed the Marple Township engineer's stormwater comments with reference to this application?
I did not. Just the post-construction plan.
Have you reviewed the township engineer's stormwater calculation review with reference to this project?
No, I have not.
Have you supplied any written documentation of any specific violations of the township zoning and or land development code with reference to this project?
No, I have not.
Are you aware that the developer has complied in all respects with the township code with respect to stormwater management calculations and with respect to the township engineer's comments with respect to adequate design of stormwater basins?
I think only two things I can say is one is I'm familiar with Meliora Design, Michelle Adams's reviews and conflicts, I guess, on what the township has approved. That's the one. And the second is a lot of my testimony went beyond the scope of this application because it focuses on the realities that water runs downhill, and the reality is flooding is already problematic, and by cutting down a forest you're going to exacerbate that flooding.
Well, we can agree that Michelle Adams is not the township engineer.
That's correct.
And did you hear Ms. Adams' testimony?
I did.
Are you aware of the fact that Ms. Adams did not even utilize the statistical analysis that's required by the township code as used by the township engineer in reviewing this project?
I'm not familiar with that.
Sorry, I have no further questions.
All right, Mr. Stein, thank you very much for your presentation tonight.
You're welcome. Thank you, everyone.
Mr. Joe, would you please elevate James Schmidt to panelists.
Mr. Schmidt, you need to, okay, you're unmuted.
Mr.
Yes.
Schmidt, are you there?
Audible?
Yes. Okay.
Yes.
Good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, great. Thank you. Mr. Schmidt, just a big brief introduction for you. James Schmidt is a biogeographer and plant ecologist engaged in environmental consulting over the last 50 years, the last 40 of which he has headed his own firm, Schmidt and Company Incorporated, consulting ecologist. His background is a BA in geography from Columbia College and Columbia University, with an MA and a PhD from the University of Chicago. He has taught ecology and environmental science at both Barnard and Columbia University. He has participated in the impact assessments and writing of more than 100 environmental impact assessments for federal, state, and local agencies. He's a certified senior ecologist with the Ecological Society of America and as a professional wetland scientist by the Society of Wetland Scientists. He's been a resident here in Marple since 1975. He has served on its environmental advisory board for 3 decades, and he currently is a member of the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection's Citizens Advisory Council. Mr. Schmidt, is that a fair, brief summary of your distinguished career?
Yes, sir.
I also add, are you also the author of many articles and even books in your field?
Yes, I am.
If I may,
All right.
are you presenting Mr. Schmidt as a private citizen, or is he appearing on behalf of the Township Council?
He is, Mr. Schmidt, correct me if I'm wrong, you no longer serve on the Environmental Advisory Board of the Township, correct?
That is correct. There is no environmental advisory board in Marple Township anymore.
All right.
Thank you.
And maybe this is part of your question, Mr. Donahue, but Mr. Schmidt, you're not here testifying as a member of the Citizens Advisory Council of DEP, are you?
I am not.
All right. With that, Mr. Schmidt, I would ask you if you've taken the time to familiarize yourself with any of the technical reports or plans that have been submitted by this developer regarding this project.
Yes, I have examined some of the documentation of this project, which is now quite extensive. In particular, I have looked at the site plans revised most recently as of April 2020.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Schmidt. And with that, I'd ask if you have developed any opinions or insights based on your review of any of the documents, or in fact, even any of things you might have heard in these meetings or in the meetings of the Planning Commission. If you have some views to share with the board, please do so.
Thank you, Mr. Fiorentino. In my opinion, the environmental inventory of the subject property is not complete, and it precludes full assessment of impacts. My remarks are based on the developer's published information, not on field observations within the subject property. The subject property today is almost completely forested. Number one, numerous common weedy invasive species of plants are listed by the developer's consultants who concentrated on large trees. Yet no investigation by any competent botanist was undertaken during appropriate field seasons to search for endangered or threatened species of plants. Such could be expected in old growth forest, such as exists on site despite the browsing by deer. Number 2, wildlife species richness at this site was briefly described as relatively high in the Princeton Hydro Report on page 12, with much use by resident and migratory birds, despite an excess of deer. No quantification was offered for the likely dramatic decline of wildlife habitat on the property in response to the proposed development through forest removal and fragmentation of the remnant of the forest present today. Number 3, no information was prepared on the physical, chemical, or biological quality of the 2 unnamed tributary streams or Whetstone Run itself on the subject property. Seepage into the stream from an unauthorized landfill known to contain many pollutants in its groundwater was not investigated. There is no baseline for assessing surface water quality impacts in the future from actual construction and operation of the project. Number 4, a cursory statement was made that stream banks are eroded on the site, but from the photographs that I have seen presented for the hearings in this matter, the erosion is apparently a legacy from the development of upstream parcels in the watershed, specifically the cemetery to the west of Sproul Road, the Don Guanella area, and Sproul Road itself decades ago. I am not aware of any plans having been made by the developer to remedy any of the allegedly ongoing erosion of the streams on the site. Number 5, Whetstone Run mainstream is not attaining its designated warm water fishery, migratory fishery use. But that was not noted by the developer in such documents of the record as I have seen. Whetstone Run requires a formal discharge limitation, a TMDL, because of existing impairment to its aquatic life and the habitat modifications by urban runoff, storm sewers, and unspecified pollutants. But no TMDL has been prepared. Construction of the project as proposed would exacerbate the attainment of designated uses and work against the township's obligation to reduce settlement in Whetstone Run by 10% by 2023, which deadline is fast approaching. The northern unnamed tributary is a permanent stream not shown on the United States Geological Survey topographic map, the National Hydrography maps, the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection maps, or other available published sources. Because it is unknown to DEP, its protection rests solely with the township under the township's trusteeship obligations under Article 1, Section 27 of the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. The northern tributary receives landfill effluent, and that discharge is proposed to continue indefinitely. It also is to receive stormwater runoff from the proposed development. Number 7, the southern unnamed tributary is also an unnamed stream. It is subject to a pending petition for redesignation as having a high-quality attained use, warranting special protection. It too is to receive stormwater runoff from the proposed development, a potential new source of degradation. Next, the potential for dewatering riparian wetlands downslope from the development is nowhere addressed by the developer. Narrow bands of wetlands here occupy the low riparian land along the streams and receive their ecosystem supporting hydrology from rainfall passing through the upslope soils as interflow. Impervious surfaces are proposed to increase dramatically on site with stormwater collected and piped. Some of the runoff is not proposed to be controlled. Other runoff is to be briefly detained in basins. The proposed infiltration basins are likely to fail as a result of inadequate design, according to Ms. Adams, the professional engineer who has addressed this question. Thus, many on-site wetlands are likely to be dewatered by the proposed stormwater management. Nowhere has the developer addressed this matter in its application. Next, I note that the assessment prepared by Princeton Hydro is the poorest quality document I have ever encountered from that firm. The assessment appears to have been dictated and never proofread. It is padded with an extensive printout downloaded from the online U.S. Department of Agriculture Soil Survey. At least the printout correctly describes the on-site soils. In contrast, the report text fails entirely to describe the Glenville soil series on page 6 of the Princeton Hydro report. And finally, the design of these development plans does not appear to minimize forest disturbance, thereby causing unnecessary environmental damage within the applicant's property. The value of the remaining woodland fragments would be reduced dramatically for interior dwelling wildlife. Those are my comments.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Schmidt. Appreciate that. And at this time, do any members of the board have a question for Dr. Schmidt? All right. I'm hearing none. In that event, would council care to pose any questions to Dr. Schmidt?
Yes, thank you. Mr. Schmidt, it's true that you have not undertaken a personal on-site inspection or have done any on-site field work with reference to this project.
That is true with respect to my comments as delivered. I have not recently been on this site. I believe I have seen most of this site, but it has been at least 7 or 8 years since I was there.
And have you read the township engineer's information, specifically the review letters that he has authored with respect to this project?
I have seen at least some of the township engineer's review letters with respect to this project. I believe there are several of them over a period of months.
Well, how many are there, sir, to be specific?
How many what?
How many are there? How many review letters are there that have been issued by the township engineer?
I do not know. I
Yeah.
do not know. There are several. There's more than one.
Right. Do you have them right there with you right now?
I do not.
Oh. Well, have you ever compared the township engineer's review letters with the development plan?
Yes.
And what did you find?
My recollection is that the engineer has looked at the development plan and has concluded that, in his opinion, it minimally meets the requirements of the Marple Township Code. I have not undertaken to review all aspects of the Marple Township Code, so that's where the matter rests.
Thank you. And you just answered, I think, the next question I was going to ask. You haven't reviewed the Marple Township Code and applied it to this project, have you?
That is correct.
Mr. Schmidt, I have no further questions. Thank you very much.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Schmidt, thank you. I believe unless there's any follow-up questions from a member of the board, that would be all for you. All right. Thanks, Dr.
Thank you.
Schmidt. And with that, that is the conclusion of our presentations. At this point in time, we would reserve the right for rebuttal of any additional witness that the developer might choose to put on. And if at this point in time, may be appropriate for me to move for the admission of exhibits that we have submitted that have been presented by our presenters in the course of the last few meetings, but also move for the admission, to the extent that is necessary, for any exhibits that we presented before the Planning Commission. I'm not sure if those are automatically part of the record of this proceeding or not. To the extent that they are not, I request that those exhibits be included in the record before this commission.
Mr. Metlowski, if I may, this is not a formal hearing. The record is what the record is, period. I mean, that.
Yeah, I would say that, you know, anything that has been presented is before the board. As far as what was presented before the Planning Commission, I don't know how we can necessarily do that. But you know, as far as Mr. Donahue says, it's not a formal hearing. We don't have formal rules of evidence here. But anything that was presented here, the board will have the opportunity to review it if they so choose.
Mr. Metlowski, if that is the conclusion of Mr. Fiorentino, is that you've concluded, Mr. Fiorentino?
That's the conclusion of our case in chief, I suppose. Although we, as we indicated by email, we are anticipating the opportunity to present closing argument at some point.
Well, if we hurry up, we might get to that point. Okay, Mr. Metlowski, if I may, I just have one rebuttal witness to present, Mr. Cassidy. It's going to be very, very brief, and this is in respect with tonight's testimony.
Sure.
Thank you. Joseph, can you bring Mr. Cassidy in session?
He's in, just needs to unmute.
Tim, can you unmute there?
There we go. Can you hear me?
Okay,
Yes.
great. Thank you. And you, Mr. Cassidy, just very, very briefly, could you please describe for the council your involvement in this project and very briefly your background?
Yes, my firm prepared the tree replacement plan, and I'm a registered landscape architect in the state of Pennsylvania, and I've been working on this project since its inception.
Now, Mr. Cassidy, did you hear the testimony that was presented this evening with respect to your tree replacement plan?
Yes.
Specifically, did you hear comments about the methodology of the plan, the spacing involved with the plan, the species of trees described in the plan, et cetera?
Yes.
Would you please comment on what you heard this evening in that regard?
Well, I heard that there were objections to the spacing of the trees and some of the species. And I don't really know what else to say other than that's what I heard.
And what are your comments with respect to the spacing and the species of trees you utilized?
Well, first of all, some of the tree species that were referenced, specifically the red cedar and some type of dogwood that was brought up, we're not even using those trees, so I don't know what plan someone had looked at, ahead of time. But we have 11 different species that we've specified. All of them were selected, for their appropriateness for the site conditions. And we also did research to make sure that there was a high probability that they would be available commercially in the sizes and quantities necessary to fulfill the requirements of the project. And we have worked on identifying spacing that will allow for the planting of all the required 3,200 trees.
And isn't it true that as recently as this month, the township engineer has reviewed our tree replacement plan and has indicated that it complies with the code?
That is correct.
Objection, that's hearsay. He calls for hearsay.
It's a fact. It's a memo written by the township engineer. What are you talking about? Thank you.
He's answered.
Any further questions?
That's all I have. Thank you very much, Tim.
No problem.
Let me see, Mr. Caspi, give me a moment, please. I don't think I'm going to have a question for you. Thanks.
That's all we have, Mr. Matlowski. We're ready to close if Mr. Rufo says it's appropriate.
I think so. I think although I probably have to open it up to any comments from the public.
Yeah. Yeah, it'd be a good time for public comment. I guess, Joe, should they raise their hand if they have public comment, and then we can add them?
Absolutely. That's what I was going to say. If anybody wishes to speak who hasn't spoken already or testified, please, raise your hand, and I'll go to you individually. Okay. All right. I have Stephen Wolf.
Go ahead, Stephen.
Am I on?
Yes.
I don't see me.
We can hear you.
Oh, you can hear me. Okay, fine. I'm coming from a different direction, not anything pertaining to this testimony today. I'm a former principal of Loomis School, and I reside in the township. I've listened to the presentations from the previous developer and this developer, and I'm very much in favor of this development. I wish that the commissioners, this board, had approved the original plan from this developer, because it gave you a lot more flexibility than this particular plan now going forward. But I do feel that Marple Township needs to have a plan like this. We need to do what Newtown Square is doing, get into the 21st century. I mean, this particular piece of property has been in ruins for years. I mean, and then with Don Guanella going out of business, it's just sitting there idle. All the presentation today is just, I don't know what it's for. Is it to preserve the way that property looks at this time with Don Guanella sitting there empty and all those trees going to ruin? I mean, I don't know what their purpose is. I don't even know what they're trying to attempt to do. I think you need to move forward with this. I think that the developer has a very specific plan with a lot of open space for people who are environmentalists and can enjoy it. And there's with a mixed purpose property in the front, where you would bring in Wegmans and townhouses and a community that's people can walk to shop. You can have a decent restaurant in our Broomall. I mean, we haven't had a decent restaurant in Broomall in years because of the liquor law. But now that's been changed. I mean, we need to move forward with this, and I appreciate what you've presented here today. I mean, the board. I think you've all done your homework. I think the presentation from Michael Fiorentino's people is interesting, but is it relevant? I mean, as a former principal, I remember not having enough funding for the schools. This project will bring $3 million a year at least in tax revenue. That would be shared by the township and the school district. That's just the beginning. I mean, if you get into a mixed use development in the front of this, that would even bring more revenue into the township and the schools. And that's where I'm coming from. I mean, as a former principal, there was never enough money to do the kinds of things that you need to do in the schools. And I would be in favor, quite frankly, of having the school district take a little action at this point in time and distribute the developer's plan to the rest of the township. I mean, we're only hearing from a minority of people. If the rest of the township knew what was happening here, the people in the Russell School and the Loomis School and the Paxton Hollow area, those are the schools that are affected by this, and the people that will be affected by this. I mean, the school has already done a population plan, with the development in mind, which would affect the Loomis School and the Russell School and the Paxton Hollow School. As far as I know, the school district has not been very specific about using the Don Guanella School to develop Paxton Hollow. I think that may be something down the road, but I don't think it's anything in the plans right now. This development, I don't know. I mean, they've already done a population study for Loomis School and Russell School. Loomis School is now being redeveloped, and it has a capacity for at least another 50 or 60 kids. Russell School has a capacity for almost that amount as well. So this development is not going to impact the number of students going into those schools. I just think you need to move forward, and I appreciate your time. That's pretty much my presentation. I do feel that as a person in this community, what I'm saying should impact on you people who live in this community. I don't know how many of the people that Mr. Fiorentino has brought in from the outside that have nothing to do with our township or what we need here. That's pretty much it. Any questions?
No, thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate your time.
Thank you. Have a good night. Anyone else, Joe?
Yes, we have a few more. I'm gonna go to Joe and Verso.
Here you go. You hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Oh, good. My name is Joe Inverso. I live at 840 Crestview Drive, and I've been a Marple resident for the last 40 years. Speaking of the children, as the last individual just said, I was concerned and am concerned right now about an article that I read in the Delaware County magazine recently. And that article indicates that according to a national report from the American Lung Association, Delaware County's air quality is 17th from the bottom out of 3,143 other counties. What's distressing is that research shows that the air pollution is in that category, impairs lung function in children, especially children. Removing the forest would eliminate one of the last remaining air pollution filters in Delaware County, exposing children and everyone else to more potential respiratory problems. I think that we have a problem with air pollution in this county, in Marple Township, and I would like to see the few remaining open spaces that are in the county, especially in the eastern part of the county, which would be the Don Guanella property, to remain as they are. I think that it's incumbent upon the commissioners and the township to be sure, especially with regard to children, that the air pollution or that the air quality is of good standing, and that we would want to raise the amount of good air pollution, air quality in our township, and that would not be done by removing a lot of the forest in the Don Guanella property. I also suspect that this is the first episode of development that this developer may want to address. I believe that the rest of the forest may be potentially up for development in the near future when and if this project is approved. Second comment that I have is that, and I guess this is for Mr. Cassidy, with regard to the spotted lanternfly, we all seem to have a major problem with trees being devastated by the spotted lanternfly. And I was wondering if the trees that are proposed for the development would be immune or less susceptible to the spotted lanternflies, the trees that Mr. Cassidy has indicated. That would be my comment.
Thank you, Joe.
Mr. Rufo, I have Susan Miller.
Oh, okay. Thanks.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah. Hi, Susan.
Hi, how are you doing? Susan Miller. I live on Farnsworth Drive in Broomall, and I lived here all my life. I'm not going to say how many years that is, but it's a lot. And you know, the woods have always been there, and we knew that, you know, the front end was going to get developed. And I don't think that was ever really an issue except for the traffic. And with adding these homes to what is going to then be developed in the front, it's just going to be insane. I live in Lawrence Park. People cut through now to get to the industrial center that has more daily visits than industrial. And you know, people speed down Sussex. You know, it's just, the traffic's just going to be nuts. And you're adding, what, 100 and however many homes, and you're thinking 2 cars each, plus then you're going to have kids, maybe 2 kids each. So now you have 4 cars in each of those homes. Then you develop the front end and you're going to have more cars coming in from that. I mean, that's just nuts. That's it. My opinion.
Thank you.
That's all I have.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, I know that Mr. Fiorentino asked for the ability to give a bit of a closing, just with to reiterate some of their points. I think it's appropriate for both parties to maybe just give a few minutes on that before we close this hearing out or meeting out.
Sure.
Mr. Malowski, as the applicant's attorney, I'm ready to proceed. This is our application.
Yes.
I was just going to ask a question. Are they ever going? Did they give us legal briefs? I forget.
We have Mr. Donahue submitted a memorandum, and Mr. Fiorentino had previously submitted to me, in essence, the closing from Planning Commission, and if he'd like to, update that, certainly.
Okay, but we can listen. But I think everybody should hear what they have to say now too. But I just wanted to make sure. Yeah. Okay. Sorry.
Sure.
Yes, just briefly, I intend to submit a memo of law here consecutive to my closing argument.
Sorry. Thanks. I guess, Mr. Donahue, you want to go first? It's your application.
Sure. If Mr. Rufo wants me to start, I will.
Sure. Either party can start. Doesn't matter to me.
Thank you. So, Council, the MPC requires that both the township and the land developer, and whether this is a single family, a company, develop a plan cooperating with the township by following the rules of your township code. And over the course of the last 18 months, thousands of hours, multiple revisions of plans, all of the professionals engaged by the township and the developer conferred to develop a code compliant plan. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court has indicated that it is incumbent for both the municipality and the equitable owner to cooperate in developing a complete and compliant plan. And at this point in time, this is not the equitable owner of the property. My client owns this property outright. And that is exactly what has been done for this project. Now, a brief review of the code, the Marple Code, and its application to this plan establishes that this plan is compliant and should be approved in every way. First, let's look at section 332 of the zoning code, the cluster development provisions. That provides that it's the intent of this section to establish standards and criteria that permit the clustering of homes on reduced size lots in the RA, RB, and RC residential districts, in return for the permanent preservation of usable and environmentally sensitive open space. This plan involves the RB and RC and is compliant with respect to the requirements which govern open space. Let's look at Article 9 of the zoning code, the environmental protection standards. Well, what's the intent? The intent of that article is to establish standards and criteria for the protection of environmentally sensitive areas of the township, such as the floodplains, the wetlands, the steep slopes, the very steep slopes, and woodlands. I submit to you that the plan is compliant, and I'll tell you why. If you look at section 362, first, steep slope protection. It's the intent of this section to protect hillsides and their related soil and vegetative resources, thereby minimizing adverse environmental effects. Your engineer has indicated that he is satisfied and all of the requirements for steep slope have been met. Let's look at section 363, tree protection. The applicant in this case has supplied you with 2 separate plans for your consideration, a compliant tree replacement plan, or if you so choose, an alternate waiver plan which protects and enhances the old forest. The township engineer has indicated that these plans, or the plan, the replacement plan, is compliant with your township code. Not some made-up mystical standard, but your code. Let's look next to section 300-60, the flood and floodplain protection. The intent of this section is to protect areas of floodplain, subject to and necessary for the containment of floodwaters, provide adequate protection for flood-prone properties, and comply with federal and state floodplain management requirements. Again, the Marple Township standards and calculations have been satisfied. Your code has been satisfied. The plan is compliant. Most importantly, and I would like you to consider this, you realize that the rules set forth by the MPC and the rules set forth by your Marple Township Code mandate compliance if the plan is to be approved. Your township engineer has spent hundreds of hours. He has issued numerous reviews. He has performed critical analysis of this plan, causing my client, the applicant, to revise and or amend this plan on at least 6 different occasions. Now, it is your township engineer's duty to do so. For a moment, forget what I have to say. For a moment, forget what Mr. Fiorentino has to say or our respective witnesses. It is your township engineer who is the arbiter. He is the gatekeeper. And he has told you and has indicated in his review letters that this plan is code compliant. Now, are you going to tell me that you're not to believe your township engineer? Respectfully, that's why you pay your township engineer. That's why the taxpayers pay the township engineers. I might not always agree with Mr. Mastronardo, but he has all times been competent, professional, and honest. He's told you that this plan is code compliant. In addition to Mr. Mastronardo, you have the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat, the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, the United States Department of the Interior, and the Delaware County Planning Commission, all indicating that this plan passes muster. Also keep in mind that this is only the preliminary approval, not the final approval. This is still be subject to your review down the road and the review of other agencies. This developer has complied with your code. He's followed the rules. With all due respect to Ms. Miller, the last person, resident of the township, who talked about traffic, you realize that there is no mitigation required for any intersection caused by this development, not one. And in fact, folks, the opposition can't put up any testimony in that regard because that is a fact. Now, if I could take one moment and talk about the Environmental Protection Act. The Environmental Rights Amendment was adopted in Pennsylvania by Pennsylvania in 1971. And it says the people have a right to clean air, pure water, and to the preservation of the natural, scenic, historic, and aesthetic values in the environment. Pennsylvania's, I quote, public, I say it again, public natural resources are the common property of all the people, including generations yet to come. As trustees of these resources, the Commonwealth shall conserve and maintain them for the benefit of the people. Now, the key word there was public. This is not public property. This is private property. Any developer, any one of your taxpayers or a citizen has a constitutionally protected right to develop his or her own property under the Pennsylvania Constitution, under the United States Constitution. Private property owners have a constitutionally protected right to enjoy their property. That applies to each and every one of your citizens. Commonwealth Court of Pennsylvania noted in 2018 that the second sentence of the Environmental Rights Amendment includes the term, quote, public, end of quote, to indicate that it did not apply to private property rights. Now you say, well, what do we do to balance environmental concerns with private property development? It's an easy question to answer, because the balancing of environmental societal concerns involving private property is achieved through the legal process, and in this instance, by the MPC and the Marple Township Zoning Code. That's the exercise we've been going through over the last 2 years. Section 604 of the Municipalities Planning Code addresses the Commonwealth's duty and provides in relevant part. In the Marple Township Code states, to promote and protect and facilitate any and all of the following: the public health, safety, and morals, and general welfare, as well as preservation of the natural, scenic, and historic values in the environment and preservation of forests, wetlands, aquifers, and floodplains. Now, municipalities such as Marple does not have the power to act beyond the bounds of the enabling legislation. And Marple lacks the power to replicate the environmental oversight of the General Assembly, which has conferred that power on the DEP and other state agencies. Marple Township has, consistent with its duties under the MPC, balanced competing values of general environmental interest and private property rights in draft zoning code and subdivision and land development ordinance. By virtue of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania have provided Marple Township through the MPC the power to regulate private property. Marple Township has and is complying with the provisions of Article 1, Section 27 of the Pennsylvania Constitution by following the Marple Township Zoning Code in Saldo. Marple Township, as an instrumentality of the state, possesses no other independent power to enforce or consider Article 1, other than the provisions contained in the zoning code. Thus, there's no merit in the claim that the proposed development, which complies, as in this case, with every aspect of the Marple Township Zoning Code in Saldo, violates any constitutional provision. Now, let me get away from the legal speak for a moment. Let's talk practicalities. Do you realize that by following the arguments of this radical group, the EPA argument, in the context of this case, you would be establishing a new burden for every private landowner in Marple Township? Any one of your citizens that wanted to build a new addition on their home, put up a garage, build a new home on a piece of property, or some new business to come in and build in your township, what you would be telling them is that even if they follow all the rules, even if they follow the code to the letter of the law, that's not enough in Marple Town. That these people, your citizens, would have to obtain the subjective approval of some advocacy group, like the Whetstone Coalition. I would submit to you, if that were to happen, Marple Township would have no rules. What you would have in Marple Township would be mob rule. Counsel for the opposition, in closing before the Planning Commission, and in this case, has suggested that in a case where I was involved as a solicitor in Concord Township, the Concord Township rejected the developer's land development application based on the EPA. That is nonsense. The primary reasons that that development was rejected, unlike this case, there were at least 10 violations of the Concord Township zoning code and saldo. 10. In this case, there are none. And what Mr. Ferrantino forgot to tell you, that in that case, a developer was attempting to construct 3 high-rise apartment buildings immediately adjacent to a residential neighborhood, literally casting a shadow on the taxpayers' homes. That is certainly not the case here. As I have indicated earlier, landowners may develop private property so long as they do so in compliance with the NPC and the Township Code. The opposition here can make no real argument that this plan is not compliant. Rather, they resort to scare tactics, specious arguments, and fake internet postings with the precise aim to intimidate the governing body. For example, they raised the issue of flooding, yet this plan conformed and complies with all storm water requirements. The opposition is supposedly concerned about environmental cleanup, yet the DEP has approved this environmental remediation plan. The opposition raises open space as an argument against approval of this plan, yet the developer is providing more than 15% open space than the code requires. Opposition also raises the loss of trees and forests as a reason to deny approval of this plan. However, the developer is complying with the requirements of the code. Will plan in excess of 3,000 replacement trees and or provide you with some other remediation plans should you so desire. This plan has been developed by the leading experts at great cost. Simply put, the opposition has no valid arguments to support their desire to have you deny the plan. Do you realize, please pay attention to this, do you realize that not one of the 8 witnesses presented by the opposition in this case can point and provide you with one violation of your township code? None. The Village of Sproul Road is a plan developed and presented after thoughtful consideration, cooperation, and consultation with the township and following the township code and playing by the rules. Where a subdivision plan complies with all the objective provisions of the applicable subdivision ordinance plan, that plan must be approved. Now remember a couple things. This is an administrative review and is not subject to discretion. If we follow the law, we follow the rules, we meet the rules, you must give us a preliminary plan approval. Also keep in mind that this is a preliminary plan application at this point, not a final, not a preliminary final. And it will still be subject, after preliminary approval, to the jurisdiction of Marple Township and outside agencies such as PennDOT and the DEP. This project is an exclusively designed neighborhood that will enhance the dynamic community of Marple while preserving important, sensitive environmental areas. Thank you for your time and consideration.
All right. Members of the commission, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Solicitor, on behalf of the coalition of organizations, I present the following closing. I'd like you to understand that at the heart of this consideration is the loss of 46 acres of mature and in some cases old growth forest, the last tract of significant forest in eastern Delaware County. The development is wrong for Marple Township, it's wrong for the people here, and it's wrong for the environment. We've presented 7 witnesses, not 8, 7 witnesses for your consideration. They provided evidence of non-compliance with the tree protection provisions of the zoning code, inadequacy of the investigation into the environmental values and resources present on the land, into the contamination that's present in certain areas, and the inadequacy of the stormwater management system, with numerous provisions found to be very questionable in terms of their compliance by our experts there as well. I will briefly summarize some of the testimony, and then I intend to, with the equal time that was granted to council, summarize the legal position with regard to the Environmental Rights Amendment. Our stormwater engineer, Michelle Adams, alerted you to a massive increase in runoff from the site because of this development, an extra 18 million gallons per year based on the developer's own calculations. And she noted that the DEP makes developers design a system based on a 2-year storm. You've seen from the evidence that we showed tonight that just in this past summer, we had 2 storms that significantly exceeded that 2-year storm. Ms. Adams also has very real concern about whether your regulations as they exist are going to be adequate to protect the township and downstream communities from the effects of the stormwater flows. So can you truly recommend approval? Can you truly grant approval to a development which will result in those kinds of increases in stormwater? Ms. Adams also explained that the stormwater basins on the development are inadequate, likely to function poorly based on their design, with resulting erosion and sedimentation, flooding, loss of base flow to the streams and wetlands on the property, and reduced stream quality. She also mentioned the improper assumptions by the developer's consultants regarding absorption that can be expected from lawns on the property, which she indicated are far poorer at accepting rainwater and preventing it from runoff than, of course, forests would be. Now, she indicated, and it's in the evidence, the various provisions of the stormwater ordinance that she does not believe the development is likely to comply with, and they are identified in her slides. The development is also poor planning because of the design and grading that will be implemented. As the architect and planning consultant Jay Cooperson showed, dozens of the planned units are poorly situated alongside steep slopes or swales, some of with much of their basements actually situated below the level of those swales. He found that the relationship to many of these homes to the landscape is going to be awkward, and safety will be a concern. He also sees erosion and flooding to be expected in the future, and that the township certainly can be expected to be receiving the calls of angry and desperate homeowners in this development in the future, while this developer has sold off and moved on. Our following witness, Rick Ray, the horticulturalist, testified to the overall health of the forest as being far better than what was portrayed in the consultant's reports, and many of the trees marked as diseased and given just a few years to live may actually live and heal themselves and live up to 50 years. He stated that the tree replacement plan necessary for this approval is non-compliant. He explained that the developer's consultant took improper exemptions from the compensation that your code requires for 266 mature trees that are slated for removal by this development. Now, without those Section 363F exemptions, the developer will need 532 additional 3-inch trees to be planted in order to satisfy the code, your code. The problem is they apparently lack the room to properly plant even the 3,200 trees that they are currently acknowledging that are necessary in that tree replacement plan they have. Mr. Ray testified to the spacing of those trees as being inadequate and anticipate a reasonable survival rate for those trees. And for that reason, the plan also cannot be deemed compliant. Lastly, Mr. Ray noted that even with 2 3-inch trees, it will take 20 years for those 2 trees to reproduce stormwater management benefits that you would get from one mature tree that you're taking out. We followed that with Tim Devaney, an arborist, who informed the board about strategies available for vine removal. And he had several pieces of evidence to support his experience. He opined that the trees freed from vines, which is a fairly simple endeavor, can generally make strong recoveries, those trees. On that basis, Mr. Devaney found it entirely inappropriate under the tree protection ordinance of Marple Township for this developer to claim exemption from the 2-to-1 compensation requirement for vine encumbered trees, which the developer's consultant numbered at 443. So without a showing that a tree is dead and with an available remedy of simple cuts to the vine stems, those recoverable trees must be compensated for. The developer must therefore plant an additional 886 3-inch trees from that category alone. You put the trees from Mr. Ray and the trees from Mr. Devaney together, and their testimony to you is that we are over 1,200 additional trees that are required to be compensated by being planted on this property. But the problem is they're not going to be able to be compliant in that way because there's no room. 8 feet apart is already too tight, Mr. Ray has testified to. If you add 1,200 more trees, you're increasing it by more than a third. The density will increase very significantly, and that is unsustainable for the trees. So therefore, you're causing injury, and the township is taking it on the chin if they were to grant a waiver to those requirements. So we clearly do not advise you to accept the alternative force enhancement with the whips. That is a deep loss to the township in terms of stormwater benefits. But as you can see, the tree replacement plan itself is non-compliant, and on that basis alone, the board would be in a position to, a well-founded position, to deny this application. Darren LeBrake followed, and he identified many issues of concern with regard to contaminants, inadequate assessment of the contamination coming from that landfill. It's a deep concern, frankly, that the leachate has not been analyzed and testing has not been done in the groundwater below the landfill or in the streams. That is simply irresponsible, and it's not acceptable. Now, the other side says that you have no obligation and no ability to look at the waters on this property, but that's not really true. Because of the Environmental Rights Amendment, you have a duty as a municipality, as an instrumentality of the Commonwealth. You have the same duty as the state to make sure that the Environmental Rights Amendment is upheld because you're considered a trustee of the public natural resources. And contrary to counsel's claim, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court has clearly ruled that things such as trees, things such as surface water, groundwater, flora and fauna, the wildlife, the plants, all of these things that are present on this property are considered public natural resources, regardless of whether the property itself is in private hands. And therefore, your right and your duty to protect those lands, your obligation is there and you must carry it out. Briefly, regarding our Mr. Stein, Fred Stein presented the obligations that reminded you of your obligations under your MS4 and the pollution reduction plan to reduce by 10% the pollution loading of things such as sediment from the creeks in your township. And if you allow a development to go forward that is going to increase stormwater flow, that's going to increase erosion. We have evidence of that effect, competent evidence to that effect. And that's what you can expect, is that you're going to have a very difficult time meeting your obligations. Another reason why you should take into account a denial of this application. Dr. Schmidt finally testified to several things. He found the environmental assessment was inadequate, not up to standards of quality. He also indicated that you would expect a likely be watering of the wetlands on this property, and that is a protected natural resource, public natural resource, those wetlands, dewatered by the basins and the stormwater collection instead of the typical natural flow of water down into those wetlands that we have now. He lastly said that there will be no baseline of data for assessing the water quality impacts of this construction because no data has been collected. Now, quickly, if I may, to the issue of the Environmental Rights Amendment. It was 2017 that in the Pennsylvania Environmental Defense Foundation case that the PA Supreme Court awakened the Environmental Rights Amendment to the Constitution, which is Article 1 of the Pennsylvania Constitution in 1971. And the way the council wants you to consider that constitutional amendment is that it essentially carries no power at all. Well, that's actually the way the law used to be before 2017, because you see, shortly after the Environmental Rights Amendment was passed, lower courts such as the Commonwealth Court established a new test under the Payne versus Kassab test, which basically said, hey, you're going to have to look at the environmental right, see if an environmental right has been violated. Just check and see. Were you able to satisfy, do you have a permit? Were you able to satisfy the requirements of an ordinance or a regulation? If you've satisfied those requirements, then you're fine. There's no Environmental Rights Amendment violation. And that essentially allowed municipalities and the Department of Environmental Protection to put up whatever kind of levels of protection they wanted. It made the actual constitutional rights of persons essentially meaningless. But in 2017, that all changed because the Supreme Court explicitly overruled that Payne test. And it's going to be in my memo of law, which I'm going to send to you momentarily. With that thrown out, what happens now is you essentially have to take a constitutional analysis. Every municipality has to examine their duties under the terms of the Environmental Rights Amendment language itself. People have a right to clean air and pure water, preservation of natural, scenic, historic, and aesthetic values of the environment. The public natural resources are the common property of all people, including generations yet to come. You are the trustee under the last clause. So we ask you to consider your duties to make sure that there are no violations. And frankly, the way this has been interpreted is to say, well, we take a look to see what is being proposed. What will we allow by our action approving this development? Will the development result in an unreasonable degradation to the environment, to the rights that people have to a clean environment and to these public natural resources, which includes things as small as the invertebrate communities that hold up the water quality and are at the basis of the ecosystem in these streams that Mr. LeBrake testified to. It's all the life forms. So if you're going to take your duties as environmental, as a trustee seriously under the Constitution, then you're going to have to look at the evidence we presented, which showed you many instances of degradation that will be caused by this development. We believe those are compelling. So in addition to the fact that based on the Adams analysis on the stormwater ordinance, based on Devaney and Ray's analysis of the tree protection ordinance, this development is non-compliant if you look at it from a code perspective and at the level of municipality planning code, as Mr. Donahue would like you to do. It's non-compliant in substantial ways that you are within your rights to deny. But I'm going to tell you that there is a higher law than even the municipality's planning code, which is a statute, and that is constitutional law. So you do have a duty under the Environmental Rights Amendment to go beyond it. Now, you may not be able to create a regulatory scheme such as the DEP has created, You don't have that power. Right? That's agreed. You don't have that power, but you do have a responsibility to determine, to do a pre-action analysis and determine whether or not what you're going to do is going to cause an unreasonable degradation that is a violation of the Environmental Rights Amendment. If you find that one will occur, then you are obligated to deny the application. And I suggest to you that we have presented sufficient evidence for you to come to that determination as well. And I'm just going to lastly close with the fact that this law has also been interpreted in Delaware County by the Court of Common Pleas by Judge Green in the appeal of Mutchler case, where the court decided that a pre-action analysis was necessary at the level of a subdivision and land development proposal. At the plans that were, the application that was before the municipality there, that was appealed to the Court of Common Pleas, and the Court of Common Pleas judged that a proper analysis of whether there was a violation of the ERA had not been performed by the municipality, and he remanded it back. And that's the law here. That's the precedent here in Delaware County. And we followed up with that. We're beyond that now to the case in Concord Township, which Mr. Donahue was the solicitor for, and he pointed out there were other violations of the code, and that may well be. But there's no question that the findings of fact and conclusions of law that he submitted to decide that case specifically referenced violations of the Environmental Rights Amendment as part of the basis for the decision to deny that development. And it's really the same thing here, but Mr. Donahue is in a different role in this position. So I ask you to consider your duty very seriously under the Environmental Rights Amendment and conclude in a way that Mr. Donahue, as solicitor, concluded in Concord Township. So respectfully, I do urge you, don't recommend approval. Don't recommend. Keep in mind that your own planning commission could not recommend approval of this development, and particularly with regard to the tree protection ordinance noncompliance. They did not recommend it to you. So take that into account, and I do ask you and I urge you to deny this application. Thank you very much for your indulgence on this, and at this time, I will be submitting my memorandum of law, where you can see all of the permutations of that Supreme Court case and others. Thank you.
Thank you.
Joe?
Yes.
I think at this point that that's about all you're going to hear on this. Obviously we've had, I think, 3 or 4 meetings on it, a number of witnesses presentations. Mr. Donahue, we currently, the applicant has granted an extension to the township, which would expire at the end of November. I don't believe the board is in a position to make a decision this evening. So I'd ask if your client would be kind enough to grant an additional extension, basically just through the middle of December. I think the commissioners meeting is, I think it's the 14th or the 15th.
Correct. It's the 14th, Adam.
Yeah, December 14th.
Yes, sir.
I think the board would be in position to make its decision that evening, but would like to take some time to review the testimony that it's received and think about it. And would that be acceptable to the applicant? Would you be willing to grant that extension?
Sure. My client and I and Greg, we've anticipated this request. And we would certainly, and I don't want to inconvenience this council over the Thanksgiving holiday, et cetera. So we'll give you up and through midnight of the 15th of December. Does that sound fair?
Yeah, that's good. And you'll reduce that to at least an email tomorrow or something for me.
I would ask for something in return, though. This is with the understanding that there'll be no other comment of any sort with reference to this matter. This matter has been closed, and that also that if the township does receive a memorandum from Mr. Fiorentino, that we be provided a copy thereof. We may or may not care to respond to that.
Yeah, and I was going to ask if with the new deadline in effect, I would ask that if either party has anything that they would like me to consider as the solicitor to advise the board with respect to legal, that by the end of November, if anybody wants to submit anything. Now, I understand Mr. Fiorentino is submitting today. Did you copy Mr. Donahue on that?
Yes, I did. It should be in both of your inboxes at this time. And did I hear that that the applicant has submitted a memo of law to date?
Yes, we did submit a brief analysis of the EPA. I'd be happy to provide that to you.
Yeah,
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, please provide each other. And
okay. I simply request that council also eats Thanksgiving dinner, and so maybe we have until December the 7th to reply to emails if need be.
Yeah, just just to give us time to look it over and also to be able to discuss the law of the case with the board. So,
Adam, if it's on our agenda for our meeting in December, do we not have to allow for public comment on it?
No. If I may, Mr. Rufo, I believe that would be inappropriate because the record is now closed. I'll leave that up to your solicitor, but I believe that would be inappropriate.
Well, I think we do have to take public comment to these, but it can be limited to the 3 minutes. And
well, of course it would be. I'm just wondering if it's on our agenda. I thought we were in a position.
I agree. No, I agree. But we're not going to hear any more witnesses or anything. It could only be residents or taxpayers.
Right.
And they could only.
Adam, I respectfully, I think that puts the applicant in a position we can't defend ourselves. I mean, and I don't think the council wants me to come to the meeting and start making another argument. I mean, the time for.
Well, I think. Well, let's put it this way. I mean, I think the arguments have been heard. What you would hear from public comment is either people saying, "Please vote for this" or "Please vote against it."
Well, but if I may, the time to do that was now. You have been more than given the public ample opportunity through all these hearings to make comment, and it would be in my opinion, and I think it would be error that if you allow comment to take place after the close of this hearing. That's why we did this evening. You've already asked for public comment. You asked for public comment last meeting. You asked for public comment the 2 meetings before that. It would be inappropriate, and I think quite frankly, it's error.
Okay. Well,
I'm not trying to be argumentative. I'm just trying to follow the rules.
I hear you.
I don't think it would change anything, to be honest with you. I think
we've asked the public if anybody has anything to say that they say them at these hearings. Mm-hmm. And so hopefully, if anybody had any comments to offer.
Adam, the only thing I'm going to say, do you hear me, John Longacre?
Yes, sir.
Okay, what I'm going to say is, remember, there's other rules we have to go by when it comes to public hearings and meetings.
That's what I'm thinking. I'm thinking of the open meetings law as opposed to.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking of too. I mean, if this doesn't apply, I have no problem. But if it applies, then we have to listen whether we want to or not.
Well, that is not exact, and I'm not trying to be argumentative, sir, but that's not necessarily true. For instance, if we decided not to give you an extension up through the 14th, but made it 2 days before, you wouldn't be able to take public comment.
That's true. That's true.
Okay, and I'm just.
No, I disagree with that here, though. I mean, if we had to schedule a special meeting for the end of November in order to meet the time deadline, at that meeting we'd still have to take public comment. I mean, that's what the open meetings law says.
Adam, if we did take take public comment, I would not want to hear from people that we've already heard from. Any of the experts. Okay, it's strictly if it's somebody in a household that hasn't spoken to us before, then I might be okay with that. Otherwise, I think we should shut it down.
All right. Well, we'll give it some thought, but this town has always erred on the side of openness and compliance with the open meetings law, and my advice is always going to be consistent with that. So, but regardless, we're not going to hear from any other witnesses. There's not going to be any more testimony presented with respect to this. The board has heard, I don't remember if it's 3 or 4 nights, to be honest with you at this point. Planning Commission had, I believe, 3 hearings at least on it. It's been reviewed by everybody. So you have all the information that you need to make your decision. So with that in mind, do we still get the extension, or do I need to schedule a special meeting?
We'll have the extension, but my comments, I mean, I'm not backing off my comments. I think it's,
I understand.
You do what you like.
Thank you. Okay, with that, Mr. Chairman, I think it's appropriate to adjourn the meeting.
Okay, meeting's adjourned. Everyone have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you.